Good evening, all. We will give folks 1 or 2 more minutes to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we seem to have a critical mass of our committee members, so we'll go ahead and kick off the meeting. Welcome, everyone, to the November cycle meeting of Manhattan Community Board 5's Transportation and Environment Committee. I'm the chair of the committee, EJ Kalafarsky. We have 2 items on our agenda this evening. One, which is an application, 2 applications actually for intercity bus stops in the district, and a presentation from the MTA. So without further ado, we will dive into our first agenda item of the evening. Members of the committee who have done diligence on the application will introduce it for us, and then the applicant will have an opportunity to speak as well. At that point, members of the committee will have the opportunity to ask questions of the applicant. Members of the public who are in attendance will have the opportunity to comment or ask questions themselves. And finally, the committee will go into its business session to decide what, if any, action to take on each issue for the evening. And that'll be the general order of operations for each of our agenda items tonight. So without further ado, Pete and Sarah, would you introduce our first application of the evening for us? I believe it's an application by Monroe Lines for a bus stop on 5th Avenue between 46th and 47th Street, and 6th Avenue between 46th and 47th Street.
Sarah, do you want to speak or do you want me to do it?
I thought you were going to take charge, but I'd be glad to chime in.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I walked the site with Sarah the other day, and then I also talked a couple of times with Abe Bocklowitz from Monroe Bus Lines about the application. So the first application is 5th Avenue between 46th and 47th Street. It's a current bus stop for the M1, M4, and Q32. It will be a shared stop. They're going to have 3 daily pickups Monday through Thursday, as well as 4 daily drop-offs Monday and Thursday, and an additional drop-off on Friday at 8:35. And then the second stop, also the same company, is 6th Avenue between West 46th and 47th. This one will have 3 daily pickups Monday through Thursday, with an additional pickup on Friday, and there'll be 4 daily drop-offs Monday through Thursday, with an additional drop-off on Friday. This bus line is primarily running from Monroe to the Midtown District. Primarily, I believe their target audience are people that are working in the Midtown and Diamond District area. They had stops or additional stops pre-pandemic, and they're now building back up now that the pandemic is sort of ending. And I'm sure ask additional questions during the presentation from Mr. Falkowitz.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it. Abe, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good evening.
Great. Thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Yeah, feel free to let us know anything else you think we should know about this application.
So I believe, good evening, first of all, and thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I think Pete pretty much laid it out. It's very simple. I'm just going to add a couple of things. So this is actually an existing stop. We had a previous owner, Monroe Bus Corp, that ran this stop, I think, for quite some time, pre-pandemic. And then after pandemic, we took over the line run, reapplied for the bus stops. So basically nothing changed, still the same shares, still the same bus stops, still the same commute, pretty much commuter. The only thing that did change is they had a lot more runs because it was a lot more busier. The Diamond District was more busier, the area was more busier. So they had more drop-offs and pickups. We cut it down to kind of 3 pickups and 4 drop-offs Monday to Thursday, and one-on-one on Friday, a pickup and a drop-off for both stops. Both stops are about 5 minutes apart from each other. So there's about a pickup of 5 minutes on timing from each other. The commute, as Pete laid out, is an Orange County commute. This is actually for the County of Orange. It starts out in Monroe, New York, comes into Midtown Manhattan, and then continues on to Brooklyn. So there's additional stops on Delancey Street, and there is some in Brooklyn, depending on the run, depending on the timing. Some of them don't. Some of them continue all the way to Brooklyn. Some of them go just to the Lower East Side, I guess, depending on busy and depending on the timing. Also, Pete, we had a discussion. He asked me about average passenger. So, of course, the 205 pickup has less passengers, I would say in the 30 range. The later evening pickups have more, depending. I mean, it's coming back now. They do, some of them are 40, some of them are a little bit, in the 40s. It's hard to, to be exact, depending on the day, depending, certain days, depending how busy the area is. Route driver comes out of Lincoln Tunnel and drops off Fifth Avenue, then drops off 6th, and vice versa in the pickup. And that's pretty much it.
Okay, thanks very much for that additional context. I just have 1 or 2 clarifying questions, and then I'll throw things open to the rest of the committee to ask any questions that they have as well. So to clarify, in terms of, as you said, these were pre-existing pickups and drop-offs, and a line that operated prior to the pandemic, hasn't been operating for the last 2.5 years, but you're now restoring service that existed prior to that. Is that right?
Not exactly. So what happened was, let me just give you a very brief. So there was a company called Monroe Bus Corp. The company existed for over 40 years. A little bit of pre-pandemic, they kind of gave up the transit run. They said they had enough. Older people were involved, and they said they had enough of this business. So we jumped in, me and Ellie Gelb, which is the owner of the Monroe Bus Lines. We took over the whole entire transit run. So it's not only the stops, it's everything else there is. You can imagine Brooklyn stops has most probably on an average day 17 pickups, 17 drop-offs. Those are primarily where the customers go. But there are certain times of the day that we do service through Midtown, and then we have a direct pickup from Midtown, and as well as B&H Photo, we service them as well. That's what we took over. So it's kind of, we stepped in to do the entire run for them, the entire county run. It's not only this part of it, it's a huge part. This is just one part of it.
Sure. Yeah. I think from our perspective, I think I'm just asking from the perspective of, Fifth Avenue and Sixth Avenue experiencing these pickups and drop-offs. Right. It'll essentially be a restoration of pickups and drop-offs that were happening at these same locations at roughly this volume prior to the pandemic.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. One other clerical thing I just wanted to check on, the recommendation letter, the two recommendation letters from the Department of Transportation. I know that you've been kind of on our docket and maybe sort of deferring coming to us for a couple of months at this point. The referral letters that we have from DOT say we're asking for comments from the community board on this proposed stop within 45 days of the date of this letter, and the letters are dated August 8th. That 45 days obviously like expired around the end of September. Do you know if DOT has extended that? Are they still waiting for our comment? Have they gone ahead and pulled the trigger on this without us?
I don't think so, and I'm clueless. Originally, I was contacted by community board somewhere in September, and I couldn't do it because of the holidays. And I asked them to push it off for 1 month. I don't think, as far as we know, DOT in New York City, they don't act that fast usually. But when you have to get a stop, of course you have to have mercy. But to remove or to remove something, I don't think so. I'm not sure though, but I don't think so. Not that I heard of.
Okay, thanks. Mike, you don't know if we have any DOT representatives in attendance tonight, do you?
I don't think we do. If I remember correctly, though, after we pushed this back from the September meeting, I think we communicated to DOT that this was going to be heard at a later date. I don't think we got anything from them in writing necessarily saying that they would hold off on taking action until then, but I believe that was the understanding between us and DOT.
Okay, thanks. I mean, we'll see how our discussion goes here, but perhaps if this is restoration of pre-existing pickups and drop-offs and mostly uncontroversial, maybe that's fine. Thank you, Abe, for the answers to those questions. At this point, I'll throw things to the members of the committee. If you have any questions about this application, please use the raise hand feature. Yeah, George. George, you're on mute. You can unmute yourself.
Eric.
Thanks.
I know we discussed this some time ago in general, why the Port Authority bus terminal, which was built primarily because the streets were clogged with buses coming from New Jersey and other points. And the idea was to put them in a terminal so that they would be more efficiently handled. It seems that we're moving away from that concept. I think it's a serious mistake. I think the committee should really say our streets are too valuable to be used for buses that could be coming into the bus terminal, since they're coming from New Jersey or through the Lincoln Tunnel. I think there were two arguments made. One was that the bus terminal is overwhelmed. Well, I think the bus terminal has had a substantial decline in use since the pandemic occurred, and there was another argument. But anyway, that there's also a question of whether the Port Authority charges a fee for buses using the terminal, and therefore there is an incentive to get out of the terminal and save some cash. Is that true?
Abe, are you able to tell us whether or not you looked at going into the Port Authority bus terminal?
No, to be quite honest, we haven't, because it wouldn't serve the purpose for this for the passenger ridership to go into the Port Authority for that. But as far as a fee, I'm clueless about Port Authority. How do you get? I know for a long time before in the charter industry, Port Authority was not easy to get in. Only the big companies, Greyhound or Adirondack or ever ran under their license were able to get a slot or a spot in Port Authority. You couldn't get for a charter bus for commuter. Even bigger companies than us, Mertz and all that do curbside pickup or drop-offs, couldn't get any spots. But I did not look into it, to be honest with you.
Okay.
So it's not, but the problem is it wouldn't serve. If we drop off in Port Authority, it wouldn't do the same service at all.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. I mean,
Um,
George, I think you're right that, you know, this comes up almost every time one of these intercity, well, I don't know that we would consider this intercity service. It's not exactly DC to New York, but you know, for everybody's context, the situation as we understand it legally is that, and this has kind of been the long-standing policy conundrum that we as a community board find ourselves in. Our understanding is that DOT will approve these applications. They actually feel that they are, according to interstate commerce law, required to approve these applications. Where we have best leveraged our voice on these applications is to determine whether the spot that they've chosen is good or catastrophic. And DOT has at least shown that they are amenable to taking our recommendation under advisement if we recommend a different location. So, you know, unfortunately, we have no authority over DOT to say turn down these, you know, applications if we feel like we don't want more buses on the street. They do tend to listen to us and take our recommendation under advisement if we suggest a different location for the stop that they will almost surely approve. So, George, in terms of our longstanding policy at this point, you know, we've determined that it doesn't get us anything to just straight up deny this application. We certainly write into our resolutions that we don't want to see more intercity pickups and drop-offs clogging up the streets than New York historically had. That we do believe that when the Port Authority bus terminal is reconstructed and, as is currently planned, a new intercity bus complex gets added to it, that all of those intercity buses get moved into the terminal, into the new intercity terminal. And certainly that's our longstanding policy as a board. In terms of action to take tonight, I think we should certainly emphasize that as we do, that is the long-term solution for intercity buses in New York City. But I think we're in the same position where we always are, where if we just choose to deny this application, we will get ignored. I think, as is often the case, the way we can best leverage our voice tonight is to determine whether this is a good location for these buses or not. Yeah,
I'd like
Sarah.
I'd like to add some observations. I was there with Pete, and
Sure.
there's a building going up, so the area looks really open. Otherwise, there would be skyscrapers there. The other bus stops on Fifth Avenue and Sixth Avenue are M2, M3, M15, and also a Rockland County bus. And I guess, okay, on that would be on the 6th Avenue. On the 5th Avenue, there was an M1, M4, and Q32 Penn Station, also a Monroe bus line. It did not seem busy when we were there, which was 10 to 11 o'clock on a weekday morning. There seemed to be a lot of space. There were about 4 lanes, but that was one time only. So there did seem to be a lot of space, 4 lanes. And that's just my observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right.
We don't, we have not, particularly over the course of the pandemic when we weren't seeing too many of these applications, we don't have, as some committees do, a formal matrix by which we run each application through. But back of the envelope, certainly it has been our experience that these, you know, in terms of metrics for determining whether this would be a good location, if it's a stop that's already used by certain bus lines for pickups and drop-offs. It usually would not be too disruptive to add another, a incremental number of pickups and drop-offs. Certainly, if it was previously used by the same service for pickups, and if the location was previously used by the same service for pickups and drop-offs, as in this case, it would not seem to be too disruptive either. So those in general, based on our experience, are decent points in favor of this not being dramatically disruptive new volume or traffic or pickups and drop-offs in, say, a new location that is not accustomed to it. Just to add a little bit of context to how we have evaluated these in the past. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Okay, George, I think your hand is still the previous one.
Yes,
but-
of course.
Okay, thanks.
Get an answer I was looking for, but that's all right.
Yeah, no, sorry.
How do you take the hand down?
Oh, I think
Lower
it's probably
hand
the
on the
same
bottom.
button. Yeah.
The same
Oh,
button
lower
is
hand.
raised.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Okay, we'll
There we
throw
go.
things now to members of the public who are in attendance. If you have a question or a comment to this application, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom now. And if you have a question or comment, please try to tell us either where you live or what your affiliation is, and try to keep it to about 2 minutes. Not seeing any hands on this application from any members of the public who are in attendance. I guess that's it for questions. Okay, with that, the committee will go into our business session. During the business session, it'll just be incumbent on members of the committee to speak amongst ourselves and decide what, if any, action to take this evening. I'll start off with respect to all of the very good points that George has raised, which is that for inner city buses that are coming in from, say, other cities and dropping off large volumes of people, they should be operating out of a terminal such as they do in DC and Boston. We're very much on record saying that is the case, and fortunately, that does seem to be the long-term plan for the reconstruction of the Port Authority bus terminal. As I mentioned, from a perspective of what to do this evening and what our precedent is on the board, we happen to know that our voice is best leveraged here by weighing in, under the assumption that DOT is going to approve this no matter what, which they've demonstrated, by weighing in on whether or not this is an appropriate location or not. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that this is the prior location of this service and is an existing and operating 2 locations for MTA bus service would seem to indicate this is not going to be very disruptive, and that does seem to be the impression that we're getting from Pete and Sarah as well, who visited the site and did diligence. So in broad strokes, this does seem to be a fairly straightforward, rubber stamping, so to speak, of pre-existing service, pre-pandemic service in these locations. But I would be curious to hear any comments in agreement or violent disagreement from members of the committee. Yeah, George, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you've said, and on the other hand, things have changed. There's been a considerable interest in making street space available for pedestrians and for amenities like plants and trees. That has changed from 20 years ago when the Port Authority bus terminal was originally built. There's also a question of whether to expand Penn Station, whether it should be a new tunnel from across the Hudson. when I first joined this committee, I raised the issue of having a comprehensive view of transportation in the region and not taking just one element at a time. We have a primary coming up shortly, or an election coming up. We may get a new governor, we may get the same governor, who knows? But this is a time to suggest things that these are controls that the governor has a strong element to participate in. And particularly, do we want to expand Penn Station? Do we want to expand it for rail, or do we want to expand it for bus, et cetera, et cetera? These are all state issues that we, to a fair extent, will be dealt with by the governor, whether it's a current one or a new one. And if we don't raise the issues, they never get discussed by anybody. So the reason we're raising them is because the street space is a precious item for all of us. And the fewer buses that are using the street, there's more space for pedestrians and trees and amenities and the like. So it's a multifaceted issue, not just the issue as it was described. And so I think in the longer term, we should have a policy that says we would prefer to have buses use bus terminal, or better yet, even use the train system that is apparently going to be expanded or may be expanded. Can't we get our act together? Thank you. End of rant. I'm sorry, I won't say anything more tonight.
It's okay. Thanks, George. I certainly have no problem, whatever short-term position we take on this particular application before us tonight, reiterating in our resolution that our, longstanding official position as a board is that when the intercity bus terminal is constructed, intercity buses should pick up and drop off, particularly intercity buses that are point to point, and make one drop off in the city, that they should all be moved into that intercity bus terminal. And certainly we could reiterate our position on Penn Station redevelopment as well. There's no reason why we shouldn't reiterate those in our resolution, and can even make sure that this most recent resolution reiterating those positions is sent to more of our electeds to make sure that they're aware of that as well. I think that's a good idea.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah.
I just wanted to mention that the Fifth Avenue side, the Fifth Avenue area, does have a building going up under construction in the northwest corner. So it looks very open right now. But when I was there for about an hour, there was hardly any traffic at all, cars or buses. Maybe that's just the pandemic, or it was that weekday morning from 10 to 11. On 6th Avenue, the area is narrower, and it would be a little bit harder to squeeze more bus traffic in, but it could be done, I think. Anyway, that's my observation. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that. I mean, that's very helpful perspective. Any other comments from any members of the committee? So, given the long-standing precedent that we tend to follow on these applications, given the fact that there don't seem to be any specific concerns about these two locations, and given that they were they're pre-existing bus stops and pre-existing pickups and drop-offs for this service, it sounds like this would be, relatively straightforward to say that we don't have a better location for these two stops. And, in the absence of hearing any kind of contrary opinions on the committee, it does seem like that's the direction we're leaning in. I do think, as George noted, we should certainly reiterate our board's position that when the intercity bus terminal is constructed, point-to-point intercity bus traffic should drop off in that terminal and not on our streets. I think we should absolutely reemphasize that via our resolution. In the absence of any other comments, would there happen to be a motion from any members of the committee? Yes, Pete.
Motion to support this resolution, to support this application for these two stops.
I
Thank you, Pete.
second it. I second it.
Thank you, Sarah, for the second. We have a motion and a second, so we'll take it to a vote. A resolution supporting this application and reiterating our long-term position on the construction of the intercity bus terminal. Let's start with John.
Yes.
Sarah.
Yes,
Tristan.
Yes.
Kathy. Kathy Kine. I guess we lost her. Maki.
Yes.
David.
Yes.
Jean.
Yes.
BJ.
Yes.
Pete.
Yes.
Janice.
Yes.
George.
No,
Joel.
Yes.
Sam.
Yes.
And I'm a yes as well. Okay, thank you to the members of the committee. Thank you, Abe, for joining us tonight and for all the information you provided. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
All right, with that, we'll move to the second item on our agenda this evening, which is a presentation on a pilot program by members of the MTA. Do we have members of the MTA on the call with us?
AJ, this is Ernest Monterelli from the MTA.
Hello.
So good evening, CB5. My name is Ernest Monterelli. I'm the Assistant Director of Government Community Affairs for the MTA. I'm here with Howie Levine, who is with our accessibility team. And we are just here to give you an update on a program that we are doing regarding accessibility. And I'm going to hand it over to Howie for the presentation.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ernest. I'm going to share a slideshow we have with the board. Give me one moment. Can everyone see the presentation?
We can.
Perfect. You can hear me all right?
Yep, you're good.
Thank you, Chair. So good evening, everyone. As Ernest said, I'm Howie Levine. I'm Senior Accessibility Officer at the MTA. I'm here to talk about our bus open stroller pilot, as well as give an update on a few different things we're working on at the MTA related to accessibility. So first off, just want to set the baseline about where our stroller policy is today. So right now, if you're getting on a bus with a stroller, the requirement is that that stroller has to be folded up before you get on the bus to not impede circulation on the bus. And so that requires caregivers, you can see in the image, to fold up the stroller before they get on the bus, hold the child, keep them safe as they do that. And this policy creates a significant hurdle for caregivers who ride the bus and can slow down the trip for everyone. If they don't know about this policy, they get on the bus, driver asks them to fold the stroller and politely holds the bus for a minute while they take care of that and get safely seated. So we have been working on this. We created a working group in the spring to determine whether the MTA can safely accommodate open strollers on buses without impeding access for other customers, particularly those with disabilities. The pilot is a direct result of a months-long working. This pilot is a result of this working group, which met for a number of months over the spring and summer, and included disability advocates, parent advocates, and bus operators. Working group reviewed a number of things: seating options, feedback from other cities that have these policies, as well as possible safety concerns. And so we're launching this, and so on a few routes throughout the city, and I'll get into those in a moment, but in terms of what you'll see on the bus, the goal was ultimately to create a segregated space and a designated space there without removing as few seats as possible. And so importantly, I'll note there's no overlap between these designated areas and the wheelchair securement area and priority seating areas at the front of the bus. These are more at the rear and the middle of the bus. And so there's 2 types of buses on this pilot. And so you'll see the areas are in different places on the different types of buses. And so in the top image here, there are 2 seats removed. And so the designated area is just in front of the rear door on our local buses. And then the second picture on the bottom, there are 2 flip-up seats across from the rear door on the buses. And that is where the designated stroller space is on other buses, including the M31, which goes through CB5. So the M31 I just mentioned and CB5 is why we're here, but we have a number of routes throughout the city, the B1, the Q12, the Q50, the BX23, the S53, and S93. And on these routes, all of the buses have been retrofitted to have the designated space. Of course, just want to say that, buses are sometimes switched out for maintenance or other purposes. And so the way to know you're on a bus with the designated stroller space is to look for that icon, that little sticker on the front of the bus you can see in this image. And these routes were selected due to higher ridership, dedicated bus fleets where we can make sure the buses are consistent, they have this designated space, and as well with geographic equity in mind. So the M31 that runs right through CB5 is one of these routes. Runs from 11th Ave and Hell's Kitchen across 57th Street, the whole length of CB5. Turns north on Sutton Place, which turns New York Avenue, and then north to 92nd Street. Connects numerous bus, subway lines, and serves schools, playgrounds, hospitals, and a number of cultural institutions, particularly in CB5. So you get a real broad array of ridership and see, how this process works. And, that's kind of what we're testing. Measure use of this by customers, see what the customer's reaction are to this space, both customers using this space and customers who aren't using this space but are riding these buses. Compare the 2 options on the different style of bus, the seat removal, as you can see where the mother is with the stroller in this picture, versus the flip-up seating space, which is what you'll see on the M31. Determine any operating constraints, concerns, feedback, and of course, identify any safety concerns. So this started in late September, and so is fully out now on all the buses on these routes have the designated stroller space. And so we're rolling this out now and getting feedback. And so I'm going to now roll into broader accessibility things. I have just a few slides on this, and then I think we'll take questions, if that's all right. So on just broader accessibility work that we're doing at the MTA, one of the main things I wanted to highlight is that the MTA recently committed for the first time to a date, 2055, when 95% of our subway stations will be made accessible. This is a settlement with 2 lawsuits that we've agreed to. There's several milestones between now and 2055 to make sure we're on track to meet this commitment. And so we're very happy with this. This is a long time coming, and we're continuing to take steps to make sure we meet that deadline. And just want to note that right now we have 140 stations across every borough that are accessible. A large percentage of them are in Manhattan, particularly in CB5. And making a station accessible is more than elevators and ramps. So we have ADA boarding areas, which are in the middle of our subway trains near the conductor, where the gaps between the trains and the platforms are minimized and as close as possible and ADA compliant. Additionally, the areas in the middle of the train, so you can board and exit where the conductor can see you, make sure that's done safely. Also putting the tactile warning strips you can see on the bottom right of this slide, as well as Braille signage, and making sure our station agent booths are made accessible as well. And so in terms of making our system, 95% accessible, the way we do that is mainly through our capital plan. And our current capital plan is making 70 stations currently accessible, which is the most ever. We do these, they're 5-year capital plans. So this is the 2020 to 2024 plan. And so right now, even with COVID-related delays, 23 projects are currently in construction, and we expect 13 more to start by the end of the year. It's just a map on the right. You can see in blue, recently completed projects, and in red, projects that are currently in construction. And this is publicly accessible. The URL is at the bottom there. And so this is a list of, across Manhattan, all of the ADA station work we have. So, ongoing, particularly at the southern end of CB5, we have work at the 14th Street, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue complex that's ongoing. Recently completed the 57th Street, 7th Avenue, big transfer point for the NQ, R, and W lines. And then we have a number of stations here on the right that are still in the capital plan, but have yet to begin the construction process. And so a number of big complexes, including Bryant Park, 5th Avenue, as well as the 7th Avenue BDE station, both in CB5. So, and so lastly, one other thing that we've done that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, but is really important, is at all of our accessible stations, we install auto gates, which is what you can see here in the picture, which is similar to the gates that all stations have, with the difference that these gates open automatically when you tap Omni or use your Metro card at them. It used to be that these were only for folks that had specific Metro cards that they were deemed to need the auto gate. And so we've changed that recently. So now any customer who swipes any Metro card or taps any Omni device can open these doors, because you might not need it all the time, but you're entering with a stroller, as in this image, or you have luggage, a bike, or of course you're a person with a disability and you have a mobility device and need it all the time. So we're very happy that we were able to do that and just kind of make everyone's trips a little easier when they need that. And of course, it's also, as you exit the system, there's the same Omni and Metro card swipe, but of course no fare is charged when you exit the system. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming in to show this to us today. For the context of the committee, while it's obviously incredibly helpful to see information about these pilot programs and provide feedback to the folks at MTA who are here today. My understanding is that this is an update and not necessarily something that you're looking for some kind of formal position on, Howie. It's correct. Correct me if that's wrong, but it sounded like you were okay. Yeah. So I think they're here to hear our feedback and provide an update to us. I'll just kick things off by I was curious. You pointed to the overall time frame to make 90% of stations accessible, and you said there are milestones along the way. Sounds like one key milestone is 70 stations by 2024, by the end of the 2024 capital project. Am I characterizing that right?
So not quite, I guess, would be my honest answer to that. So okay. The commitment with those stations, and I can pull that up in a second. Let me stop sharing this for a moment so everyone can see more easily. So the capital plan is every 5 years, and that's been the case for decades. And so every 5-year capital plan, there's a certain number of stations that were deemed we had the funding to make accessible, as well as, all of the state of good repair projects and expansion projects like 2nd Avenue Subway are all in the capital plan for those 5 years. And so in this capital plan that was approved in 2019, there were 70 stations, the most ever to be made accessible. But that's separate from the milestones that are in the settlement agreement that was agreed to this summer. And so those milestones, for example, are procuring contracts to make accessible 81 stations by 2025. So it's actually more, and 11 additional in that 1 year. Another 85 stations in 2035, another 90 by 2045, and then another 90 by 2055.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. I was curious about the pace of those. So,
and of course, it's awarding contracts. It's not finishing the stations. There's often a gap there. So just want to be fully transparent about that as well.
Okay, thanks very much. My only other question was, you said the pilot has been going since September. Do you have any conclusions or indications as to how things are going with the different variants of the you talked about removing seats versus flip up seats. Is there one that's looking more likely, the likely winner at this point?
So no, not yet. We've gotten a lot of feedback from folks who are, in principle supportive or opposed, but mostly supportive, thankfully, of this pilot. But not a lot of feedback yet from people who have actually used the buses. And that's where the feedback we're really looking for is from folks who have been on the bus and take it and, what they have to say here. So we haven't gotten a lot of that feedback yet. It's still rather new, and we're going to, put out some new things in the system to try and get more feedback into us from people riding the bus. And so it's still pretty fresh, so not yet. And the space, we're going to take cues, I think, from what people say and what we find from the different variants, but there are, of course, are operational constraints with the different buses of varying ages and things like that. So it likely will never be always the same space on all the buses system wide. It'll be, slightly different on different buses.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Any questions from other members of the committee? Feel free to use the raise hand feature. The MTA is here, ready to answer your question. Yeah, John.
Hi, so how do when people get on the bus and they have a stroller, are the bus operators letting people know, hey, this is available, it's right there, use it? Or how are people knowing, it seems like with just the sticker, it's not quite obvious. So like, how are you alerting people in real time that that's available?
Sure. So definitely we've asked bus drivers to make sure that folks, especially with strollers, know that that's available when they're getting on the bus. And it's something for them to monitor. And, for example, there's only space for one stroller. So if another stroller gets on, the rule would still be that you'd have to fold that second stroller to not impede the aisle and circulation. We're also doing outreach. So we are rolling out different activities. So we're going to do that across the different routes, trying to go to libraries, other places where we can leave flyers, folks that have strollers and, or places where we can get to customers who might be, most interested in this policy as well. So we're just starting that process right now as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? All right, not seeing any other questions at this time. Howie, let us know if you have any specific questions for us or for the community in regards to the pilot or any of these features. We certainly want to be able to help provide feedback for the effort as well. If you have any specific questions, either for members of Community Board 5 to get in touch with you on, or for example, for members of the public to say, contact the board office, we can pass that feedback along to you as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Appreciated, Jared, that any, feedback you get, you can send to Ernest and we can get that to the right place and take that under consideration as we do this. And we can also, if you're getting more feedback, point you to the, the online form where folks can most easily submit feedback. Don't want anyone inundating the board office with lots of calls on this or anything.
What the board office is there for. We will throw things to any members of the public who are in attendance who have any questions or feedback. If you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom now at this time, so we can have a sense of how many people want to comment. If you have a question or comment, please announce your name, let us know whether you live in the area or otherwise have some particular affiliation in the area, and try to keep your question or comment to about 2 minutes. Only seeing one hand from members of the public. So Miriam, you can, we'll give you permission to speak. If, you can unmute yourself now, Miriam.
Hey, Miriam Fisher. I'm from the Elevator Action Group. I'm also a member of ACTA and was at the recent meeting where the pilot program was announced. I have some questions about informing riders who need the accessibility features. There are announcements now on certain trains, apparently, that it's the next station is accessible and where the elevator is, middle, front, back, which is very helpful. Apparently, not all trains are equipped to do that. I take the number 1, and I hadn't heard any signs, but when I switched to this 7, I hear it. Is there a plan to make all lines able to do this feature? That's one question. The other is announcing if the outages, because there's no announcement when you get to the next station that the elevator is not working. And how is that being addressed? Because that's very serious for people who are depending on the elevators and get stranded. So I have 2 features of my questions.
Sure. So to answer the first part, just about announcements in general, those automated announcements that say, you know, this is an accessible station, the elevator is at, you know, the rear of the platform or what it might be. So those where the trains are able to do that based on the age of the train and the technology in the train, we have rolled those out. And so as we're getting new trains, and we actually just ordered new trains that was announced at the board meeting earlier, the committee meeting earlier today, that will be available on more and more of the system. I don't have an exact timeline for that, but generally as we get new train cars and as we roll out, they replace the older train cars, that's something we'll see across the system. And then in terms of real-time announcements, so those announcements are programmed. So every time there's at a stop, it makes that particular announcement. And right now the technology, we don't have it to have that, you know, integrated with our real-time elevator status system. What we are doing is we try and encourage our customers to visit the page online that is updated in real time. We have monitoring software on our elevators in the system, and that, you know, when an elevator goes down, that's automatically updated. And so refer to that page, you know, before you take your trip, as you're on your trip. If you have a smartphone, you're able to do that to make sure you don't get stranded or you know what to expect. In addition, of course, we also have what are called AATIs, or alternative trip information signs, that are on every elevator in our system that say, if this elevator is out of service, here's the best trip to make. You know, often requires you get back on the train, say if a platform elevator is out, and go to the next accessible station and either turn around, or there may be another way to get where you want to go most quickly.
Not all riders with disabilities have smartphones, and often by the time when they get to the station, it's too late. And if they knew ahead of time, they, like we all do, if something isn't running, we try to pre-plan and see what other routes we can take. I have a lot of choices. I'm not in a wheelchair, but people who are in wheelchairs don't have a lot of alternatives, and knowing ahead of time would help the pre-planning. Can there be with all the sophistication of digital technology, have a way of announcing in real time, just like I hear on the train that this line is now going to be an express and not a local, and I know it's going to pass by my stop unless I, you know, get off ahead of time and plan. That's helpful to people, especially people in wheelchairs who get stranded. A lot of my colleagues have gotten stranded for hours at the subway, and it's a nightmare, and they're trying to work and get stuck.
Yeah, absolutely, Miriam. So as I said, we don't have the technology for that right now. You know, we do have, I mean, you can set up text alerts, for example, for specific elevators. So you get a notification, smartphone or not smartphone, that an elevator has gone out of service or is back in service. Particularly helpful for, you know, your home station relying on an elevator there. But in terms of the real-time announcements, we don't do that right now.
That's why I keep bringing it up. To spark.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for the question and the comment, Miriam. Hopefully hopefully Howie and Ernest are able to bring that back and incorporate that into MTA's planning and what services they're able to add. Okay, thank you very much for the comment. Okay, not seeing any other hands for comments or questions from any members of the public. It also does not seem at this point that we would really need a business session for the committee because there doesn't seem to be an obvious position to take here. But obviously, if I'm glossing over something or there are any further comments or concerns from members of the committee, we'll just do one final opportunity here to raise them as a question or as a comment rather, if there is a discussion that we should have. But not seeing any other hands from the committee. Yeah, BJ.
Actually, this is more of a question following up to the subway question. I know in September that the Governor Hochul announced that each of the subway cars would have cameras installed. Do you know what stage they're in or in what phases they will be doing that?
I don't have any information on the stages of that. I can get back to the board with that information if you'd like. But right now I don't have information on that.
Great, thank you. Because I personally have been in subways and twice there was some incidents where, because it was either, and it was like 10 in the morning, but the subway was, there weren't that many people. And there were two incidences where there was no police and, it was really quite an interesting situation. So I think having those cameras installed as soon as possible would be great.
I'll definitely get back to the board on the timing of the camera installation.
Thank you. And then regarding the accessibility, I mean, even I think, I think somebody else had raised that question, but right now when I get on the buses, for those assigned for senior citizens or for disability, there are people who are just blatantly sitting there and don't get up anyways. I really wonder about, I know the bus drivers cannot enforce it, but those poor moms with the strollers, even if the sign says it, and if it's a crowded bus, especially at certain hours, when school's out or rush hour, I just wonder about, the intention is wonderful, I think. But again, how to have that be enforced so that the public does support, moms with strollers would be interesting. So maybe you guys could do a campaign around good citizenship or, being a good neighbor riding the bus.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, BJ. And yeah, Ernest, if you are able to get back in touch with the board office, within the next day or two, with any information that you can provide about the timing of the cameras, that'll be great, and we can distribute that to the members of the committee.
I will do.
Thank you. Any other final comments? Okay. Thank you, Ernest and Howie, for coming in with that update and for hearing our feedback, and particularly for hearing some of the concerns of the committee and the members of the public who are in attendance. Hopefully you are able to get us some of those answers and take that back into your planning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
Bye.
That concludes the two items on our agenda this evening. Next up, we set some time aside for old business. One item of old business that we wanted to revisit was that last month we mentioned in new business that our committee members, David Sigmund and George Hikalis, would be monitoring developments around congestion pricing. Just to recap, congestion pricing is already written into state law as of 2019. So according to state law, it's going to happen for 60th Street and below. And the details that remain to be figured out are the specific tolls and exemptions. Obviously, as a district that lives entirely inside the tolling area, will be a beneficiary of lower congestion and improved transit coming from it. But as we wait for a recommendation from the Transit Mobility Review Board that we can review and respond to. We basically discussed that we'll continue to watch carefully the developments at this point in the implementation of the state law and decide, where our voice would be helpful in any way to weigh in on those details, the toll and exemptions. We're already on record officially taking a position that the Transit Mobility Review Board that's deciding those tolls should operate in accordance with the open meetings law. That is our specific request / demand. I think we're still waiting to see whether or not that is the case, but we're on record calling for it. We also asked for several representatives from Manhattan to be appointed to the TMRB with mixed results. So we're obviously waiting at this point with bated breath to see how they operate and what their recommendation may be. And as discussed at the end of last month's meeting, we're going to continue monitoring those developments, looking for an opportunity and an appropriate point to speak up or clarify our district priorities relative to the implementation, where we may be able to impact that implementation of the law. Certainly at this point, since it's already written into legislation, state law, the devil seems to mostly be in the details. We're way past the point of needing to weigh in on whether it should be law or not, because that doesn't seem to be an open question. David, are there any details that you wanted to share about what you've learned about the timeline, or what you believe some of the topics of interest that we'll continue to monitor might be?
Yeah, I can share my screen. I basically, Vicky introduced me to former chair of CB8, the Upper East Side, who's now a co-chair of their congestion pricing committee. And so they're right at the border. So they've been following this issue for a while and created a separate committee to track it, and have made attempts since 2019 to kind of weigh in on what their priorities are. They recently passed a resolution that focused on the needs of those with disabilities. But they've been tracking, some of the issues in other areas where they might weigh in on. George had raised some issues. So if we want to spend a couple of minutes, I can take people through what the status of the whole process is and what some of these ideas were. I can figure out how to do this. Sure. There we go. Everybody can see that?
Yep, we're looking at your
okay.
Google Word doc. Yeah.
So, as EJ mentioned, CB5 passed a resolution in February of 2020 that called for Manhattan representatives on this Transportation Mobility Review Board and compliance with open meetings law. And the official request from electeds in Manhattan was for a resident of Manhattan. And in fact, one of the 6 members is a resident of Manhattan. The board does not comply with the open meetings law. Other community boards have weighed in, Manhattan electeds have weighed in on that, and thus far the board does not have a compliance obligation. So that's certainly something, if we felt like we wanted to weigh back in on that, we could. The members of the board were named this summer in July. The draft environmental assessment was released on August 10th. Prior to that, there were a total of 19 public meetings briefing people on the project. And then after the release of the environmental assessment, there were 6 public hearings that were held all on Zoom. The Federal Highway Administration is the federal agency that's responsible. So it's a NEPA environmental review. And they have a dashboard that gives you the status of the review. And right now that says that they will be issuing their finding on actually January 3rd of 2023. And there was a fair amount of back and forth about something like 400 comments that were made by FHWA staff, and MTA has been working to resolve those since this past summer. And then the rest of the process is that the review board will finalize a recommendation on, tolling, on exemptions, make that recommendation to the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, TBTA, and the MTA board. There is a public hearing that would be scheduled as part of that. And then the TBTA board will approve a final recommendation. And the contractor has already been selected that will do the installation. And they have about 1 year from the time the board approves it to deliver the final system. And right now that projection is mid-2024. Some of the ideas, this is, as I said, a combination of sort of CB8, other things that I read, some things that George raised. Number one was George's primary focus of, and as we talked about on Penn Station, is by supporting through running and a regional rail system, we provide an alternative to cars and reduce congestion to begin with, rather than strictly taxing congestion as a way to avoid it. We create an alternative, and we have weighed in on that on the Penn Station plan. There's been a discussion of trying to provide additional parking near subway stations in the outer boroughs, although the environmental assessment didn't see huge increases in traffic at these outer borough stations. There has been talk of a residential parking permit in these neighborhoods outside the congestion zone to avoid people just parking on the street and then taking the subway into the zone. Something that we discussed, we had a brief session last week that could be of particular interest for our community board, is trying to make accommodation for small businesses or nonprofit businesses that will face a financial strain because of potentially the mechanics or the cost of compliance with congestion pricing. And so that's something we could take a look at. There's the general issue of the fact that yellow cabs pay a congestion fee now per ride, and yet they'll still be exposed to the new congestion fee. I don't think we're the ones that need to necessarily weigh in on that, as the yellow cab industry is doing a good job of representing their own interests. There were questions raised on one of the public sessions that I listened in on by some of the Manhattan electeds about, would we be looking at peak versus off-peak, surge pricing, varying tolls by vehicle weight or emissions, and that currently is not specifically part of the program. If anybody reads the Streets blog, they did a piece on Cornell Tech has an app that's actually being used in Bogota, where they've got a congestion pricing program, and it is a voluntary app by users, payers of the congestion pricing fees, and what time of day are they using the system, and what are they paying. And so they've been using this app as a way of providing real-time feedback on how the system is working, and that's something we could support. Issues that have been raised on privacy protection. There was a line in the legislation that was passed in 2019, but it's very general. There's nothing specific about how the tolling equipment should be installed within historic districts, not necessarily a CB5 issue, because most of this equipment occurs adjacent to the FDR, or the West Side Highway. And then people who had concerns about MTA's operating budget and whether these revenues should be locked away separately so that they're used appropriately. The balance of the issues that have come up are all about, who should get a discount, and should there be exemptions. I guess I would point you to the last item, which is right now there are no exemptions in the legislation other than incomes lower than $60,000 a year, and official authorized vehicles that transport people with disabilities. like Access-a-Ride. And anything in items 1 through 6 would be new. And if you followed any of the public discussion of this, anything that's a new exemption means the toll goes up for everybody else. And so they gave a toll range as low as $9 if there were no additional exemptions, and as high as $23 if there were exemptions, you know, for people that use the Lincoln Tunnel, you know, or if you look at this list, you know, there were a whole bunch of different ideas. But anytime you add an exemption, it increases the cost to the rest of the system because there's a revenue requirement in order to fund a portion of the MTA's capital program. So, I mean, you can look at this. I mean, I think, you know, where we left this is if people want to, we can circulate this document, and if members of the committee want to take a look and weigh in on whether the committee, CB5, has a role in weighing in on these issues.
Great, thanks, David.
Yep.
Yeah, you know, speaking for myself, the question is always how best to leverage our voice. It certainly appears at this point, like, as I said, it's written into state law. It's going to happen in some capacity, and that, you know, to my perspective, there is very little use in us, say, taking a position that just says, yay, congestion pricing, or we hate congestion pricing. That argument was that debate was 3 years ago, and it is now written into state law. Certainly, I think there is opportunity perhaps for us to continue to monitor particular issues such as the exemptions and the tolls, and a number of the other issues that David listed and pointed out. And there does seem to be, you know, the most obvious place to weigh in such that we end up getting heard seems to me to be less about trying to weigh in with the somewhat opaque TMRB, but to rather be able to respond to the draft recommendation that comes out of the TMRB via the public hearing process that we know needs to take place before the MTA board actually votes on final exemptions and final tolls. That seems to be the best opportunity to not only have our voice heard in a public forum where it's going to get the most attention, but to frankly influence the final decision by the MTA board based on, you know, whether or not we determine over the course of monitoring this process, whether or not there's a concern or a particular problem with the exemptions and tolling that we feel we want to influence in the interest of our district. That is one, to my mind, one potential approach for us to take, to continue to monitor here and to see that public forum process before the final MTA vote as perhaps the best time to weigh in, if indeed we have specific topics or concerns to weigh in with. Curious as to whether there are any thoughts in agreement or disagreement from other members of the committee about that general approach. Obviously, we are the center of the central business district. This affects us, but you know, as I said, it does not seem like it's a good use of our voice to just take a position for the sake of taking a position. It seems like we want to say something substantive and meaningful, such that we can influence the process, such that, you know, whatever the implementation is, that it's successful and that it works for the district and for the transit improvements that it's supposed to lead to. Yeah, Maki.
Thanks, EJ. I concur with that recommendation. And just to confirm, that draft that we'll be able to comment on will be coming out in January, and there'll be a 30-day period, or what's the recommended length that we'll have to turn that around? Just wanted to make sure that it fits in with our committee meeting schedules.
Yeah, I don't know the specific timing once FHWA signs off. I mean, we'll have to see, what the ground rules are that the review board has to follow. And I mean, the process they'll follow is, I guess, anything that goes in front of the MTA board. So I'll check out, what the specifics are and report back.
Thanks, that'd be great.
And the only other thing I would add is, they point to the London program as a prime example. That program has been through many changes over time. And the TMRB is not a one-shot committee, it's a standing committee. So any changes to the program are going to go back through this process as well. So I suppose if there was something that we were particularly motivated about, and we felt we needed to do it now, we could certainly do that, but there'll also be opportunities to weigh in as the program goes through changes.
In the event that the timing is really atrocious and doesn't line up with our committee schedule, there are steps we can take to, usually to make sure in some sort of emergency, it's certainly not preferred to do it that way, but there are ways to have the discussion such that we can make sure something urgent is getting written and officially adopted in some capacity to make sure that it gets submitted to the official comment period. So we'll keep an eye on what that time frame ends up being, and hopefully they're building enough time into that process that we're able to just use our usual committee structure for that. Any other thoughts, concurrence, disagreement with that general approach? I think we talked about it a little bit at the end of the last meeting. Obviously, hopefully this is a useful update for what we're monitoring. And we'll continue to see how it goes, and we'll continue to observe that process. And it sounds like we have a default plan for what to look for and what topics to keep an eye on, and when potentially to weigh in if we see something of particular concern. And in the meantime, we'll just try to adapt to the process as we see it play out. Okay. Thanks in particular, David, for all that great research and that update. That's all we had for old business. Is there any new business this evening? George, I'm not sure if you wanted to in particular bring to, you had sent an email highlighting a town hall that was taking place tomorrow evening.
Well, I certainly can just say I sent a note to the community board just a few minutes before the meeting started, so many of you may only see it when you go back to your offices or whatever. But anyway, there is a discussion tomorrow night about improving the capacity at Penn Station by through running, as opposed to tearing out historic buildings and building a monumental expansion. Obviously, the folks that are in the path of that tearing down are quite upset about that, and most of that is in CB5. So it's being discussed in the land use side, but it is a transportation issue as well. So I'll just leave that. I would urge those that are interested in the more nitty-gritty of the Penn Station area to try to attend the through running workshop that's going to happen tomorrow night. These are all way too many complicated issues to be handled in a couple of sentences. That's clearly where we're at. Also, it's a matter of taxation with or without representation. These are clearly taxes on the public, and to what extent should a larger legislative body participate or be involved in that? And I'll leave that for scholars of constitutional law, but I do think that David explained it pretty well. That it is a law, that except that who's going to decide the amount of the tax and the benefits and how it's spent are definitely fuzzy. And I'll leave that to scholars in the future.
Okay. Thanks, George. Any other new business? All right. Not seeing any other hands with any new business. That brings us to the conclusion of tonight's agenda. Thanks very much to all the members of the committee and to everyone else who was in attendance tonight as well. Much appreciated. Hope everyone has a good evening.